Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331, Chapter 8. They flew a circuitous route to London. The morning had dawned cold and grey. They'd lifted off in a steady drizzle. Round noon, they'd been forced to bypass a storm, abandoning their intended course after a strong gust nearly tore Hermione from her broom. Much later than expected, the city's skyscrapers appeared through the twilight mist. It was like something from a science fiction novel. Tall towers of grey, sparkling with the faint lights of civilization, with all its attendant promise and threat. Hermione was experienced enough with cities to know that they'd find both. Which they found first would largely be a matter of luck. Draco fell in position behind her, allowing her to take point. She'd been to 12 Grimmauld Place more times than she could count, but had never approached by air. Landmarks became crucial. The London Zoo, Hampstead Heath just north, and then slight eastward turn to Highgate Cemetery. They dropped in behind a mausoleum overgrown with creeping ivy. They stowed their brooms in their bags and crept out onto one of the cemetery's many serpentine paths. Hermione drew her hood and shoved her hands into her coat pocket. A sideway look confirmed that Draco had done the same. "We'll need something to get you in," she muttered. "Something to prove your loyalty. Showing up with you isn't enough." You didn't need to look at him to see his scowl. "No, they'll probably think you've imperioused me. Like you could be so easily controlled," he muttered, incredulous. Hermione missed a step. The compliment, though somewhat backhanded, surprised her. "We'll need to verify our identities," she said, choosing to ignore it. "I have my sealskin." A beat of loaded silence passed. "My parents' wants. Will they accept those?" Hermione's throat tightened. "Yes, I believe they will." They passed beneath the arched entrance to Highgate, the gloom lifting infinitesimally. Hermione turned them south. "You'll be searched," she said, "and our bags emptied. You'll undergo legilimency." Draco huffed a laugh. "That won't work." Hermione grimaced. Draco's talent at occlumency had been only a well-supported rumor until now. You can't just stop." "You sound like Potter," he said, derisive. "No subtlety. I suppose you think the mind is like a book." Okay, she snapped. "They'll attempt it at least. Try not to hurt them." Another cynical laugh. "No promises." "Hey!" He grabbed his arm, pulling him to a stop in the middle of the pavement. "These are your people now, your allies." She revised at the lift of his brow. "Hurting them won't help you." "Submitting will." "Yes, they need to trust you. They can't do that if they think you're hiding something. You need to be honest with them. I'll advocate for you as best as I can, but you need to understand what you're walking into. You've been fighting against the Order for years. Their suspicion is rational, the same as your side would feel if I decided to defect." "My side would torture and kill you." "And the Order won't," she insisted, "however much they might want to. Understanding why you're coming to them now, the context behind your decision, will help with that." "And if legilimency doesn't work?" She released his arm and resumed walking, unable to meet his eye. "You'll also take Veritas Serum." Draco stopped on his own this time. "No." His answer was flat and uncompromising. Unfortunately, so was the requirement. "This is not a negotiation." "I won't take it." "Then you'll be a prisoner instead of a partner." "What are you afraid of them learning?" "You don't know what I've done." His look turned cold. She reached out to him, a hand on his forearm, steadying them both. "We've all done terrible things in this war," she said quietly. "Some worse than others. We can't go back and change it, but we can do better moving forward. The Order is the way forward for you." A muscle in Draco's jaw twitched, as if he still hadn't warmed up to the notion. "Forgive me if I'm not excited to have hostile strangers take liberties with my mind." "They're not all hostile." She endured his deadpan look, then continued. "I'll speak to Kinsley. He may let me perform the questioning under the proper supervision." A faint blush appeared high on his cheekbones. No. Why not? He shrugged away from her, something tender and sad passing through his eyes. Because you don't need to know what I've done any more than the order does. She watched him for a moment, hunched against the rain, hands tucked into his pocket. Didn't look like a war criminal. Looked anonymous, like if she took her eyes off of him for a moment, he disappeared into the London haze, despite the city's unusually empty streets. But she didn't lose him. Instead, she caught up, pulling a step ahead as she navigated them through the borough of Islington. The silence between them was as unshakable as the rain. Hermione wondered if she'd been too harsh, promised too little and threatened too much. She understood his fear, shared it even. The Order would not be happy to see him. Scenarios she'd supplied, verification, legilimency, veritaserum, were all assuming that Draco wasn't killed on sight. He needed to remain behind her, preferably out of sight. He would settle for relatively hidden until she could explain. Problems would only spiral from there. Draco had information on Voldemort was a given. Strategic objectives, locations, number of followers, areas of weakness that the Order could exploit. He might not know everything, but even his ability to confirm some of the Order's long-held suspicions would be useful. They could get what they wanted with veritaserum. They could lock him up and keep him dosed and talking for as long as they wished. Hermione suspected that this was what Ron would prefer. From a practical perspective, she recognized its merits. Imprisoning Draco and using him as an encyclopedia into Voldemort's Cold War strategy was straightforward, simple, and guaranteed results. However, she'd promised Draco some semblance of life, and he'd sacrificed for this war. Lost people he loved. He had good reason to turn his back on the hate group he'd been forced into as a child. Draco could be an asset to them. Not a spy or a mole. That bridge was quite literally burned. In his special operations capacity, however, his assistance on raids and sabotage missions could prove invaluable. He'd make a fair scout and even better assassin. His spell work was strong, and he'd already shown the proper temperament. He'd been dispassionate when he killed Raoul and hadn't shown a scrap of remorse over the chaos or the destruction of Malfoy Manor. Might not be the role he imagined or even wanted, but it was practical. A place to start with Kingsley and Harry. But it was also selfish, because if Draco were to be sent out into the field, he'd need a handler. And who better to mind him than Hermione? She wasn't a fool. Working with Draco wouldn't be easy. Everything that made him an effective killer, his detachment, his pragmatism, his capacity for violence, also made him a liability. As his handler, she would be held accountable for the decisions he made. But there was no one better equipped to handle him. She had started to understand his moods, how far she could push before he began to fray. She had the patience to endure his rages, the nerve to confront him, and was developing the good sense necessary to know what each approach was warranted. The fact that he had followed her to London, was about to walk into the headquarters of what had, until a few days ago, been an enemy organization, demonstrated the strength of trust between them. Was the trust between them complete? No. But it was more than he could claim with anyone else in the Order. And if Hermione were with him, then her time as a career would come to an end. The idea of it brought pinprick tears to her eyes. 7 years on the move. Countless journeys up and down and around the British Isles. No home base, no bed, and no stability. Draco could change that. Draco could change everything. Hope was a warm breeze against her cheeks, lessening the weight across her shoulders and harrying her feet. Visions of after bloomed like flowers from one salted earth. Harry, Ron, and Ginny relaxing and laughing in a sunny garden. Spring weddings and winter newborns, gifts that couldn't be loved with the same abandon in a world with this much uncertainty. Warm arms pulling her close, holding her tight, welcoming her home. All of it just 1 block away. But something wasn't right. Pedestrian traffic had disappeared. The streets were silent, and an ominous haze hung low in the sky, darker than a rain cloud and smelling faintly of ash. Dread crept up on her, an inescapable frost. Draco's fingers found her elbow. "Granger." "Keep walking," she muttered. "Don't stop and don't gawk." Well-intentioned advice that she could barely follow herself. Her footsteps slowed as they passed the turn-off to Grimmauld Place. Several bands of blue and white police tape crisscrossed the street, tied between two lampposts and sagging in the damp. She allowed herself no more than a cursory glance beyond the police lines, but it was enough to confirm it. The once formidable townhouse that had lined either side of the street were gone. All that remained were a few charred pieces of framing jutting up from the blackened ground like broken bones. Grimmauld Place had been razed. Draco tugged at her arm, kept her moving, and they walked in stiff silence until Hermione spotted a corner market. Its windows were boarded up, but a hand-drawn open sign had been taped to the door jamb. A young boy swept shattered glass into a dustbin, his eyes rimmed and wide. His father was on his knees near the till, reorganizing his displaced inventory and binning what was no longer sellable. "What happened?" she asked, the question little more than a croak. He looked up at her. Heavy bags dragged beneath his bloodshot eyes, but his gaze was hard, equally exhausted and angry. "Get out!" "What?" "Out!" He pointed at the door. "Right now, or else I'll call the police." "I didn't mean—" "Out!" Hermione stumbled back a step, then turned hurrying from the shop. Behind her the man had started sobbing, his grief low and grating over the tinkle of broken glass. Draco caught her arm once more. Tucked under his left arm was a paper. Couldn't remember him paying for it. She opened her mouth, turned back towards the shop, but he pulled her away before she could argue. "We have bigger things to worry about right now." He looked both ways before crossing the empty street, steering them towards a small park. They abandoned the path a few yards in. Draco pulled her beneath a large tree and handed her the paper. "London bombed. Capital city hardest hit in the latest bout of terror attacks." She looked up at him. She'd seen these words before, knew their meanings, but the order in which she read them, what they meant. The headlines didn't make sense. What is this?" "It's them. Hermione, it's them." She shook her head and looked back down at the paper. "No," she said. No, it can't be." Her eyes skipped the article's fine print down to a bulleted list of locations. South Kensington, London. Fulham, London. Castlefield, Manchester. Bearsden, Glasgow. Browdorn. She waited for the pieces to slot together. "These were all suspected locations." Draco trapped the list with a finger. "They didn't know, so they—" He paused, voice turning bitter as he finished. "So they got them all." "Oh." She flipped to the second page, filled with black and white photographs, still lifes of wrecked cities. All. Her knees buckled. Draco caught her, an arm around her waist, keeping her aloft. "Steady there, steady." You knew." She slurred against his chest. "No." He took her by the shoulders, tried to look her into her eyes. "No, I didn't. I knew about London, like you knew about the Isle of Man. But I couldn't have known about this. I've been with you, Hermione." He caught her eyes. "I'm with you." Her head spun as the only other possibility presented itself. "Scabia," she whispered. We didn't kill him." Draco paled. His hands fell from her shoulders, trailed limply down her arms. "His skull had cracked. I didn't think." "He must have survived long enough to apparate back, or at least send a message along." Hermione pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes, trying to stem her tears. This was her fault. How long had she been fighting? How long had she been traveling, careful to cover each of her tracks? Hermione knew better than to leave a loose end. She long understood that there was no place for mercy in war. But they'd been so eager to leave. They needed to leave. And now? She lowered her hands and looked into Draco's eyes. 4 people were permanently stationed at Grimmauld Place. Kingsley, Ginny, Ron, and Harry. What time did this happen? Draco skimmed the paper. The explosions were heard at approximately midnight 2 nights ago. Hermione nodded, the numbness settling quickly. Curfew was 10 p.m. All 4 would have been in bed. It's done, she said, voice hoarse. The order is done. What do you mean, done? Done. Over. She pushed away from him, unsteady but needing the space. Harry was all we had, our only hope. The Dark Lord is out there with a single scrap of soul and no one to take it from him. You don't know. I know, she snapped. Now was not the time to explain the weight of the prophecy or the weavings of fate. He had to trust her. We can interrupt supply lines and infiltrate governments all we want, but without someone to deliver the final blow, none of it matters. It's always going to be this. She looked around her, at a world that had shifted off its axis but kept spinning nevertheless. What was the point of continuing to fight? It was a Sisyphean task now, constant effort without the hope of reward. The last 7 years, the next 7. None of it had meant anything. None of it ever would. Hey, Draco shook her shoulder, bringing her back to the present. We need a next step. There is no next step. Why can't you understand that? It's over. Not for us, Hermione. He lifted her chin with a finger, his eyes oddly bright. We can disappear. The notion was contrary to everything she'd ever lived. As such, her refusal was unthinking and immediate. We can't. They think we're dead. He looked over his shoulder, through the slats in the park fence where the shell of 12 Grimmauld Place barely stood. They hit these locations because they thought they were hitting us. Why correct them? It can't work. Why not? This is our chance, Hermione, don't you see it? His voice was low and urgent. You said you were fighting for Potter, but Potter's dead. There's nothing left to fight for, so why not disappear? Why not try for a normal life? They'll find us. Not if we're smart, and even if they do, it will take time. It won't last. I don't care, I'll take whatever I can get for as long as I can get it. A life outside of this war, a chance to live and die on my own terms instead of someone else's. He must have seen the crack in her resolve. He stepped closer, brought his hand to cup her cheeks. We could do it, he whispered, breathing, puffing over her nose. We could survive this together. We need a place somewhere quiet to rest and regroup, and after that... Draco's eyes closed, and he rested his forehead against hers. After that he didn't know, and neither did she. But it was better than staying here. His eyes opened when she took his hand. Gazes locked, she imagined the smell of salt, the crash of waves against the rocky shore, the sight of dingy, whitewashed walls, a dark grey roof, and a faded blue fence. They disappeared with a crack. To be continued. Note by the author. This fic has 2 endings. Chapter 9 is a happy ending. Chapter 10 is not a happy ending. Your choice, dear listener. Your choice. Thank you for listening to this chapter of Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.